The rain hammered against the windows of the old warehouse as Tommy Benedetto sat in his leather chair, staring at the young man bleeding on the concrete floor. The warehouse smelled of rust and fear, a combination that had become all too familiar in Tommy's line of work. He was not just any man in the city, he was the boss, the one people whispered about in dark corners and cross streets to avoid. The young man on the floor was Marco Ricci, barely 22 years old, with a swollen face that made him almost unrecognizable. His clothes were torn, and blood dripped slowly from his nose onto the cold concrete. Tommy had known Marco since he was a boy, running errands for the family, sweeping floors, and dreaming of the day he would be respected like the older men. Tommy leaned forward in his chair. His expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the late hour. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but everyone in the room knew better than to mistake his tone for kindness. When Tommy spoke quietly, people listened carefully, because quiet words from him often meant loud consequences for others. "Who hit you?" Tommy asked, his dark eyes never leaving Marco's face. Marco tried to speak, but only a whisper came out. His throat was dry and his lips were cracked from the beating he had received hours earlier. He had been walking home from his job at the corner store when 3 men grabbed him from the shadows. They wore expensive clothes and spoke with confidence that came from knowing they were protected by someone powerful. "I can't hear you, Marco," Tommy said, his voice still calm but with an edge that made the other men in the room shift nervously. "Tell me who did this to you?" Marco finally found his voice. "They said they were from the Torino family," he managed to say. "They said I was selling on their corner, but I wasn't, Mr. Benedetto. I swear I wasn't doing anything wrong." The room fell silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. Tommy's jaw tightened almost invisibly, but his men noticed. They had worked for him long enough to read the small signs that meant big trouble for someone. The Torino family had been pushing boundaries for months. They were newcomers to the city, trying to establish territory in neighborhoods that had belonged to Tommy's organization for decades. Until now, Tommy had been patient, hoping they would learn to respect the established order. But putting their hands on one of his people, even a low-level worker like Marco, crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Tommy stood up slowly, his movement causing everyone in the room to tense. He was not a tall man, but his presence filled the space completely. At 55, his hair was still thick and black, with just enough silver at the temples to suggest wisdom earned through experience. His hands, now clasped behind his back, had built an empire that stretched across half the city. "Frank," he said, addressing his lieutenant, a heavy-set man with scarred knuckles who stood near the door. "Get Marco to Dr. Romano. Make sure he's taken care of properly." Frank nodded and moved toward Marco, helping him to his feet with surprising gentleness for such a large man. Marco winced as he stood, but he managed to whisper, "Thank you, Mr. Benedetto," before Frank led him toward the door. When they were gone, Tommy turned to face the remaining men in the room. There were 4 of them, all soldiers who had proven their loyalty over the years. They waited for his words like students waiting for their teacher to explain a difficult lesson. "The Torinos think they can come into our city and treat our people like this," Tommy said, his voice growing colder with each word. "They think because they have money and connections in other cities, they can disrespect what we have built here." He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights gleaming through the rain. Somewhere out there, the men who had beaten Marco were probably celebrating, thinking they had sent a message that would make Tommy back down. They were about to learn how wrong they were. "Sal," he said, turning to a thin man with sharp features who was known for gathering information, "I want to know everything about the Torino operation in this city, where they eat, where they sleep, where they conduct their business. I want to know which one of them gave the order to touch Marco." Sal nodded quickly. "I'll have everything by morning, boss." "Good." Tommy returned to his chair, but he did not sit down. Instead, he placed his hands on the back of it, leaning forward slightly. "And I want word sent to our friends at the docks, the construction sites, and the restaurants. Anyone doing business with the Torinos needs to make a choice. They can continue to work with us, or they can explain to their families why they chose to support people who have no respect for this city." The men understood. Tommy was not just planning to retaliate against the Torinos. He was preparing to cut off their sources of income and support. It was the kind of systematic approach that had made him successful for so many years. "What about the police?" asked Vince, a younger soldier who handled many of the family's legal problems. Tommy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Detective Morrison owes us 3 favors. I think it's time to collect one of them. The Torinos have been operating without proper permits for their construction work downtown. I'm sure Detective Morrison would be very interested in investigating code violations." As the men began to file out of the warehouse to carry out their orders, Tommy remained standing by his chair, staring at the spot where Marco had been lying just minutes before. The young man's blood had left a small stain on the concrete, a reminder of the insult that could not be ignored. Tommy had not built his organization through violence alone, but he understood that respect was the foundation of everything. When people stopped fearing the consequences of crossing him, everything he had worked for would crumble. The Torinos had made their move, and now it was time for Tommy to make his. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. The voice that answered was gruff and tired, but it snapped to attention when the caller identified himself. "It's Tommy. I need you to gather the boys, all of them. We have work to do tonight." The warehouse was empty now, except for Tommy, but he could feel the machinery of his organization already beginning to move. Phone calls were being made, favors were being called in, and men were getting dressed for what promised to be a very long night. Tommy looked at his watch. It was just past midnight. By morning, the Torino family would understand that there were consequences for disrespecting the established order in his city. They had asked for a war, and Tommy Benedetto had never been one to refuse such a clear invitation. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the city clean for what was to come. The clock on the church tower struck 3 in the morning as Sal Martinelli's car pulled up to the warehouse. He had spent the last 3 hours driving through the city, gathering information about the Torino family's operations. His notebook was full of addresses, names, and details that would make Tommy Benedetto very pleased. Inside the warehouse, Tommy had not moved from his position near the window. He had been making phone calls, and the results were already beginning to show. Men were arriving in small groups, parking their cars in the shadows around the building. These were not ordinary men. They were the core of his organization, the ones he trusted with the most important work. "Boss," Sal said as he entered, shaking the rain from his coat, "I've got everything you wanted." Tommy turned from the window, his face showing the first hint of satisfaction he had felt all night. "Tell me." Sal opened his notebook and began reading. "The Torinos are operating out of 3 main locations. Their boss, Vincent Torino, has been staying at the Grandview Hotel downtown. His son Anthony runs their street operations from a restaurant called Luigi's on Maple Street, and their money man, a guy named Charles Torino, works out of an office building on 5th Avenue. "How many soldiers do they have?" Tommy asked. "Maybe 20, but half of them are just local kids they hired for muscle. The real threats are the 8 guys they brought from Chicago. Those men know what they're doing." Tommy nodded slowly. The Torinos were not as strong as they pretended to be, but they were not helpless either. This would require careful planning. Frank returned to the warehouse, having delivered Marco to Dr. Romano. "The kid will be fine," he reported. "Broken nose, some bruised ribs, but nothing permanent. The doc says he can go home tomorrow." "Good." Tommy gestured for his men to gather around a table in the center of the warehouse. "Sal, show them what you found." As Sal spread out papers with addresses and descriptions, more men continued to arrive. By 4 in the morning, Tommy had assembled 15 of his most experienced soldiers. These were men who had been with him through previous conflicts, men who understood that tonight's work would determine the future balance of power in the city. "Here's how we handle this," Tommy said, his finger pointing to different locations on the crude map Sal had drawn. "We hit all 3 locations at the same time. They need to understand that their entire operation is vulnerable, not just pieces of it." He looked around the table at the faces of his soldiers. "Frank, you take 5 men and handle the hotel. Vincent Torino needs to understand personally that he made a mistake. Don't hurt the hotel staff, and don't make a mess that will bring too much attention from the police." Frank nodded. He had done this kind of work before, and he knew how to be effective without being sloppy. "Vince, you and 4 men hit the restaurant. Anthony Torino is probably asleep upstairs. But be ready for guards. These people came here looking for a fight, so don't expect them to surrender easily." Vince checked his watch. "What about the office building?" "Sal and I will handle that personally," Tommy said. "Charles Torino keeps their books there. If we can get our hands on those records, we'll know everything about their operation, their money, their contacts, their plans." The men began checking their equipment, making sure they had everything they would need. Tommy watched them work, remembering similar nights from years past when his organization had faced challenges from outsiders who thought they could come into his city and take what did not belong to them. "Remember," Tommy said, his voice cutting through the quiet preparation, "we're not savages. We're businessmen solving a business problem. The goal is to send a clear message, not to start a war that will hurt everyone's profits." At exactly 5 in the morning, the 3 groups left the warehouse in separate directions. Tommy rode with Sal in a dark sedan, following streets that were empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck. The city looked peaceful in the early morning light, unaware that its criminal underworld was about to be reshaped. The office building on 5th Avenue was a modern structure with glass walls and expensive security systems. But Tommy had been dealing with security systems for decades, and Sal had learned a few useful skills during his years of gathering information for the organization. They parked across the street and observed the building for 10 minutes. One security guard sat at the front desk, reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. The man looked bored and tired, exactly what Tommy had hoped for. "Remember," Tommy said as they crossed the street, "we're businessmen here to discuss a deal. No violence unless it's absolutely necessary." The security guard looked up as they entered the lobby. He was an older man, probably working the night shift to supplement his retirement income. "Building's closed until 8, he said automatically. Tommy smiled and pulled out his wallet. He placed $500 bills on the security desk and looked directly into the guard's eyes. "We have an urgent business meeting with Mr. Charles Torino. I'm sure you can make an exception for such an important client." The guard stared at the money for a long moment. $500 was probably more than he made in a week at this job. "What's your name, sir?" "Tommy Benedetto. Mr. Torino knows me." The guard's face went pale when he heard the name. Everyone in the city knew who Tommy Benedetto was, even security guards who tried to stay out of criminal business. The man's hands shook slightly as he reached for the phone. I'll call up and see if Mr. Torino is available," he stammered. "That won't be necessary," Tommy said gently. "We'll announce ourselves." The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave Tommy time to think about what he would say to Charles Torino. This man controlled the Torino family's finances, which meant he was probably smart enough to understand the situation quickly. Smart men could often be reasoned with, which would make this meeting much simpler. The office door had Torino Financial Consulting written in gold letters. Tommy knocked politely and waited. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit despite the early hour. Mr. Benedetto, Charles Torino said, his voice carefully controlled. This is unexpected. I hope you don't mind the early hour, Tommy replied. But we have some urgent business to discuss. Charles stepped aside to let them enter. His office was impressive, with leather furniture and modern art on the walls, but Tommy noticed that the man's hands were trembling slightly as he closed the door. I assume this is about the unfortunate incident with your employee last night, Charles said, moving behind his desk as if it could provide protection. That's exactly what this is about, Tommy confirmed. He sat down in one of the leather chairs without being invited, and Sal remained standing near the door. Your family seems to have gotten confused about how business works in this city. Charles opened his mouth to speak, but Tommy raised his hand to stop him. Let me explain something to you, Tommy continued, his voice still calm but carrying unmistakable authority. This city has rules. Those rules have kept the peace for many years and allowed everyone to make money without unnecessary violence. Your family has chosen to ignore those rules. At exactly the same moment, across the city, Frank and his men were walking through the lobby of the Grandview Hotel. Frank had called ahead to a contact who worked in hotel security, and their passage to the 11th floor went smoothly. Vincent Torino would wake up to find 5 serious men sitting in his hotel suite, waiting to have a conversation about respect and boundaries. 3 miles away, Vince and his soldiers were surrounding Luigi's restaurant. The building was dark, except for a light in the upstairs apartment where Anthony Torino lived. Vince had brought tools to quietly open the restaurant's locks, and his men were trained to move through buildings without making noise that would alert neighbors or police. Back in the office building, Charles Torino had begun to sweat despite the air conditioning. Mr. Benedetto, I'm sure we can work out some kind of arrangement. My family has no desire to interfere with your operations. I'm glad to hear you say that, Tommy replied, because here's what's going to happen. Your family is going to leave this city, today. You're going to pack up your operations and find somewhere else to conduct your business. But we've invested significant money in setting up here, Charles protested. Surely we can reach some kind of accommodation. Tommy stood up slowly, and Charles instinctively leaned back in his chair. Your family invested money in beating up a young man who was under my protection. That investment has bought you a one-way ticket out of my city. Sal's phone buzzed quietly. He glanced at it and nodded to Tommy. The message was simple. Hotel secure. A moment later, another message arrived. Restaurant secure. Tommy smiled at Charles, who was now gripping the arms of his chair tightly. My associates have just finished having similar conversations with your cousin Vincent and your nephew Anthony. I believe they will confirm that leaving the city is the wisest course of action for your family. The morning sun was beginning to stream through the office windows, casting long shadows across the expensive carpet. Somewhere in the city, people were waking up and beginning their normal daily routines, unaware that the criminal landscape of their city had just been permanently altered. Charles Torino reached for his phone with shaking hands. I'll need to make some calls, he said quietly. Of course, Tommy agreed. You have until noon to begin your departure. After that, my patience with your family will be permanently exhausted. As Tommy and Sal left the office building, the city was fully awakening around them. But for the Torino family, this morning marked the end of their brief and unsuccessful attempt to establish power in Tommy Benedetto's territory. By 7 in the morning, word had already begun to spread through the city's criminal underworld like wildfire. The Torino family's brief reign of terror had ended not with gunfire and sirens, but with quiet conversations and unmistakable displays of power. Tommy Benedetto had reminded everyone why he had remained the undisputed leader of the city's organized crime for over 2 decades. The first door to be kicked in that morning belonged to a small warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. 3 of Anthony Torino's local recruits had been using the space to store stolen merchandise they planned to sell through the family's fencing operation. When police arrived with a warrant that had been mysteriously fast-tracked through the court system, they found enough evidence to put all three men away for several years. Detective Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the police force who understood how the city's unofficial power structure worked, led the raid personally. He had received a phone call at 6 in the morning from an anonymous caller who provided detailed information about the warehouse's contents and activities. The caller had a pleasant, educated voice and seemed to know exactly which laws were being broken and how much evidence would be needed for successful prosecutions. "Looks like somebody's cleaning house," Morrison's partner commented as they watched the suspects being loaded into police cars. Morrison nodded but said nothing. He had learned long ago that some information came with invisible price tags attached. 3 favors owed to Tommy Benedetto had just become 2, but the city was also becoming a safer place for law-abiding citizens. It was a trade-off he could live with. Across the city, the second door belonged to a high-end electronics store that had been serving as a front for the Torino family's money laundering operation. The store's manager, a nervous man named Eddie, who had never wanted to get involved in criminal activity but had been threatened into cooperation, was almost relieved when federal agents arrived with search warrants. The investigation had been triggered by an anonymous tip to the IRS about suspicious cash transactions and unreported income. Someone had provided detailed financial records showing how clean money was being mixed with dirty money through fake sales receipts and inflated inventory reports. The evidence was so thorough and well organized that the agents suspected they were dealing with someone who understood both criminal operations and law enforcement procedures. "Whoever gave us this information knows how our investigations work," the lead federal agent told his team. "These records are better organized than most of our own case files." Eddie, the manager, was more than happy to cooperate with authorities when they offered him protection in exchange for testimony about how the money laundering operation worked. Within hours, the financial network that had allowed the Torino family to operate in the city was completely exposed. The third door was kicked in at a luxury apartment complex where Vincent Torino had been storing weapons and drugs as insurance against potential conflicts with rival organizations. The raid was conducted by a joint task force of local police and federal agents who had received detailed floor plans of the apartment, along with information about security systems and guard schedules. Vincent himself was no longer in the city. After his early morning conversation with Frank and his associates, the older Torino had decided that a long vacation in Florida would be beneficial for his health. He had left the city in such a hurry that he forgot to remove the evidence from his apartment, making the authorities' job much easier. But the doors being kicked in that morning did not belong only to the Torino family. Tommy Benedetto's organization was also making sure that local businesses understood the new situation clearly. At Luigi's restaurant, where Anthony Torino had been conducting business just hours before, a team of health inspectors arrived to conduct a surprise examination of the kitchen facilities. The inspection had been scheduled by an anonymous caller who claimed to have witnessed serious health code violations. The inspectors found enough problems to shut down the restaurant immediately, effectively eliminating the Torino family's main meeting place in the city. "Seems like somebody really doesn't like these people," one of the inspectors commented as he filled out the violation forms. His partner nodded while photographing a grease trap that had not been cleaned in months. "Either that, or somebody knows exactly how to make a restaurant fail inspection." The Grandview Hotel, where Vincent Torino had been staying, received a visit from building code inspectors who had received reports about fire safety violations and structural problems. The inspection revealed several genuine issues that required immediate attention, including blocked fire exits and faulty emergency lighting. The hotel's management was forced to close an entire floor for repairs, effectively making it impossible for any criminal organization to use the location for future meetings. As the morning progressed, the pattern became clear to anyone who understood how the city's power structure worked. Every business that had been connected to the Torino family was facing official scrutiny from various government agencies. Every person who had worked with them was being investigated for possible legal violations. Every safe house, meeting place, and operational center was being exposed to law enforcement attention. Tommy sat in his office above a legitimate restaurant that his family had owned for 30 years, reading newspaper reports about the morning's activities. The newspaper described the raids as part of a coordinated law enforcement effort to crack down on organized crime in the city. There was no mention of the conversation that had taken place in a warehouse just hours earlier, or the question that had started everything. Frank entered the office carrying a cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. "The Torino's moving trucks left the hotel an hour ago," he reported. "Vincent is already at the airport. His flight to Miami leaves in 2 hours. "And his son?" Tommy asked, without looking up from the newspaper. "Anthony's driving to Chicago with what's left of their local crew. Word is he's planning to rejoin his father's original organization there." Tommy folded the newspaper and set it aside. "What about Charles?" "He closed the financial office this morning, paid the rent through the end of the month, and had all the computers and files put into a truck. Very professional, very clean." It was exactly the kind of departure Tommy had hoped for. The Torino family was leaving quietly and completely without creating any ongoing problems that would require additional attention from law enforcement or rival criminal organizations. Sal appeared in the doorway, carrying a folder full of documents. "Boss, I've got the final reports from all our contacts. The Torinos are completely out of the city. No hidden safe houses. No remaining business relationships. No plans to return." Tommy accepted the folder, but did not open it immediately. "Any word from Marco?" "Dr. Romano says he can go back to work next week. The kid wants to thank you personally." "That won't be necessary," Tommy replied. "Just make sure he understands that what happened to him was unacceptable and it has been dealt with appropriately." The phone on Tommy's desk rang, and he answered it with a simple, "Yes?" The voice on the other end belonged to Detective Morrison. "Thought you'd like to know that we wrapped up those warehouse raids, found enough evidence to put away some very unpleasant people." "I'm always pleased to hear that law enforcement is keeping the city safe," Tommy replied carefully. "Funny thing, though," Morrison continued. "All the evidence was gift-wrapped and delivered with a bow on top. Whoever provided that information really wanted those arrests to happen. Justice has many allies in this city, Detective." "Indeed it does. Have a good day, Mr. Benedetto." Tommy hung up the phone and looked out the window at the city street below. People were walking to work, opening their businesses, living their normal lives without fear or concern about criminal violence. That was exactly how Tommy wanted it to be. The Torino family had learned an important lesson about respect and consequences. More importantly, everyone else in the city's criminal underworld had learned the same lesson by watching what happened to people who tried to challenge the established order. Frank cleared his throat softly. "Boss, what do you want me to tell the boys? Should we expect any retaliation from the Torinos?" Tommy shook his head. "The Torino family are not stupid people. They made a mistake, they paid for it, and now they're moving on. If they were planning retaliation, they would have stayed and fought. The fact that they left so quickly tells me they understand the situation clearly." He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, watching the city wake up around him. "Besides, Frank, we didn't hurt anyone. We didn't steal anything. We simply made it clear that certain behaviors have consequences. The law enforcement officials who raided their operations this morning found real evidence of real crimes. We just helped the evidence find the right people." Vince knocked on the open office door. "Boss, there's a delegation here from the Dock Workers Union. They want to thank you for helping them resolve their labor dispute with the Torino family." Tommy smiled slightly. The Torino family had tried to muscle in on several legitimate businesses during their brief time in the city, including the Dock Workers Union. Those workers were now free to conduct their business without fear of intimidation or violence. "Tell them I appreciate their gratitude, but that won't be necessary. Everyone in this city deserves to work without fear. As his men left to carry out various tasks related to returning the city to normal operations, Tommy remained at the window. The question he had asked in a warehouse just 8 hours earlier, "Who hit you?" had led to the swift and complete removal of a threat to his organization and to the stability of the city's criminal ecosystem. The morning sun was now fully illuminating the streets below, and Tommy could see vendors setting up their sidewalk stands, shopkeepers opening their stores, and children walking to school with their backpacks and lunchboxes. It was a peaceful scene that represented everything he had worked to protect and preserve. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear sirens, probably police or federal agents conducting more raids on locations connected to the now-departed Torino family. By afternoon, the city's newspapers would be full of stories about successful law enforcement operations against organized crime. The reporters would never know that the morning's events had begun with a simple question asked by a man who refused to let disrespect go unanswered. Tommy's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. E. Romano. "Patient will make full recovery, no permanent damage, professional work." Tommy deleted the message and returned to his desk. The city was secure, his organization was intact, and justice had been served through proper legal channels. It had been a good morning's work, accomplished without a single shot being fired or a single unnecessary act of violence. The Torino family would remember this lesson for years to come, and other potential challengers would think carefully before testing the resolve of Tommy Benedetto's organization. Sometimes the most effective displays of power were the quietest ones, and the most lasting victories were won through intelligence rather than brutality. As Tommy prepared for a day of normal business operations, he reflected on the simple truth that had guided his success for so many years. Respect was not taken by force, but earned through consistent action and maintained through unwavering resolve. The morning's events had served as a reminder to everyone in the city that some questions, when asked by the right person, demanded immediate and thorough answers.